back door of the burger chef was unlocked. The lights were off, the cash was gone, but the money bag was still inside the office. 4 young employees had walked out into the cold Indiana night, and none of them ever came home. It was November 17th, 1978, and by the time the first officer arrived at that Speedway restaurant, the dining room was empty. Coats were still hanging on hooks, and one girl's car was untouched in the lot. How does an entire closing shift disappear from a lit-up fast food restaurant on a main road in under an hour without a single customer noticing? The first real clue took investigators almost 2 days to find, and by then the case was already unraveling. In the next few minutes, we will walk through the timeline of that night, the 4 victims, the 3 main suspects the FBI still names, and one detail from the crime scene that investigators missed for nearly 48 hours. Detail number 3 is the one that still haunts this case. If you follow Unsolved American Cases, subscribe. We cover a new one every week. To understand what happened at that burger chef, you have to understand how ordinary the night began. November 17, 1978 was a Friday. In Speedway, Indiana, a working-class suburb just west of Indianapolis, the Burger Chef restaurant at 5725 Crawfordsville Road was doing steady but unremarkable business. It was cold, in the mid-30s with a light wind. The restaurant closed at 11 p.m. 4 employees were on duty for the final shift. Their names matter because everything that has been written and speculated about this case in the last 4 decades has revolved around them. Jane Freet, 20 years old, was the assistant manager. She was serious, responsible, the one holding a set of keys. Ruth Ellen Shelton was 17, a senior in high school, working the shift to save for college. Daniel Davis was also 17, working part-time. Mark Flemons was 16, the youngest of the group. 4 young people doing an ordinary closing shift in an ordinary restaurant on an ordinary Friday. At some point between 11 p.m. and midnight, all 4 of them walked out of that building. They did not go home. And when the story of the Burger Chef murders is told, the first thing that has to be said is that we still, in a real sense, do not know what happened inside that restaurant that night. We know pieces, we know contradictions, we know a scene that investigators themselves later admitted was mishandled from the very first hour. Everything else has been argued about ever since. The first person to realize something was wrong was not the police. It was a coworker. Around midnight, another Burger Chef employee named Brian Kring drove by the restaurant. The lights inside were off. That was normal for that hour. But something caught his eye. Jane Freed's car, an orange 1974 Vega, was still in the parking lot. So was Mark Flemons' vehicle. He didn't stop. He assumed the closing crew had gone for food somewhere and would come back. It was only later, when he learned the restaurant had been left unlocked and money was missing, that this small detail became one of the most important observations of the night. At around 1 a.m., a Speedway police officer was dispatched to the Burger Chef after the district manager, Robert Yeoman, was contacted. Yeoman had received word that the restaurant had not been secured properly. When police arrived, what they found should have been treated instantly as a crime scene. Instead, it was treated as a robbery, and that decision would poison the investigation for years. The back door was unlocked. The interior lights were off. The safe had been emptied of roughly $500 in cash. But there was something odd. A money bag with additional cash was still inside the office, sitting in plain view. Some of the employees' personal belongings were still there. Ruth Ellen Shelton's purse, jackets, a pair of glasses. 4 people had gone. Their belongings had not. And here is where the case takes its first devastating wrong turn. The officers on scene, and later the arriving managers, assumed the 4 employees had staged the robbery themselves. Perhaps they thought this was a prank or a scheme, and the teenagers had run off with the money. They did not seal the building. They did not photograph it thoroughly. They allowed managers, corporate representatives, and cleaning staff to enter the restaurant. By morning, the crime scene had been walked through, wiped down, and effectively reopened for business. Fingerprints were lost. Fibers were lost. Any chance of tracing exactly who had been behind that counter that night was, in the space of a few hours, quietly erased. For the families of Jane, Ruth Ellen, Daniel, and Mark, that first night was a slow, terrifying dawn. Ruth Ellen was supposed to come straight home after her shift. She never called. Her parents began phoning the restaurant, the police, anyone who might know. Mark's family did the same. So did Daniel's. By Saturday morning, 4 sets of parents in Speedway were making the same phone calls, being told the same thing. The police believed their children might have stolen the money and left of their own accord. It was not just wrong, it was, for those families, an insult layered on top of terror. And then, on the afternoon of Sunday, November 19th, almost 2 full days after the disappearance, a couple walking in a wooded area near Big Walnut Creek, in a rural stretch of Johnson County about 20 miles southeast of the restaurant, came across a body. Then another, then 2 more. All 4 employees found together, in the woods, off a small road. This was the moment the case stopped being a suspected robbery and became something far worse. This was also the moment investigators realized how badly the scene at the restaurant had been compromised. The condition of the bodies told its own terrible story. And here we need to be careful, because these were 4 young people whose families still grieve them. Ruth Ellen Shelton and Daniel Davis had both been shot, 2 gunshot wounds each from a small caliber firearm. Jane Freet had been stabbed. The knife blade had broken off inside her body. Mark Flemons had not been shot or stabbed. According to the coroner, he died after suffering a severe blow to the head and choking on his own blood. Investigators believed he may have been struck while trying to run. 4 young people, 4 different endings in the same patch of woods. Whoever did this, investigators would later say, was either more than one person or someone acting with a level of cold efficiency that is extremely rare. And this is where the second act of the investigation begins, because with a mishandled restaurant scene and a rural body site already exposed to the weather for nearly 2 days, detectives were left with almost nothing physical to work with. What they had instead were witnesses, rumors, and a fast food chain that had been robbed multiple times in the region that year. The first serious theory was that the murders had grown out of a robbery gone wrong. Burger Chef restaurants in Indiana had been targeted repeatedly. A crew of local criminals was known to have hit similar fast food locations. Under this theory, the killers walked in at closing time, forced the 4 employees to open the safe, and then, panicked or recognized, decided to remove witnesses. The unlocked back door, the missing $500, the abandoned personal items all fit. The problem was the missed money bag in the office. Real robbers would have taken it. And the drive to Johnson County, 20 miles into the countryside, was strange behavior for a robbery crew. If the goal was cash, why the detour? Why the woods? Investigators from the Indiana State Police, the FBI, and the Speedway Police Department eventually built a short list of suspects. The names most often associated with the case are 3 men whose paths crossed the Indianapolis criminal underworld of the late 1970s. The first was a career criminal linked to a string of restaurant robberies in the area. The second was a man with a history of violence who reportedly bragged, in prison years later, that he had been involved. The third was a suspected drug dealer whom some investigators believed had a personal grievance with Jane Freed's brother, and who they suspected may have gone to the restaurant not to rob it, but to send a message. Investigators believe, but have never proven, that at least one of these men was present that night. All 3 are now dead. None was ever charged. And here's the detail I promised you at the start of this video. When investigators finally returned to the Burger Chef restaurant with the knowledge that the 4 employees had been murdered and began going through what little remained of the scene, they realized something that had been in front of them the entire time. In a trash bin behind the counter, someone had placed a stack of small paper items, order tickets, receipts, notes, that did not belong to the closing shift's normal routine. Among them, according to reporting by the Indianapolis Star in the years that followed, was a handwritten note that referenced Jane Freed by name. Investigators did not photograph or secure that bin on the first night. By the time anyone thought to look, the trash had been emptied, and whatever was written on those slips of paper was gone. That is detail number 3. A note, possibly addressed to one of the victims, thrown in the trash of her own workplace and lost because the crime scene was treated as a prank. Whether that note would have identified the killers, we will never know. But nearly half a century later, detectives who worked the case still speak about that missed evidence with an anger that has not softened with time. The families were left to fight for their children's reputations. For weeks after the murders, some in Speedway continued to whisper that the teenagers had been involved in something illicit. Ruth Ellen's father, George Shelton, spoke publicly about how painful it had been to hear his daughter, a high school senior with college plans, described that way. Jane Freet's family pushed back against theories linking her to drug activity. Slowly, as the physical evidence from the woods was analyzed and the timeline was reconstructed, the public understanding shifted. These were 4 employees working a shift. They were not accomplices, they were victims. By 1980, the case had gone cold in a formal sense, but never truly closed. The Indiana State Police kept an active file. Tips came in for years. In the 1990s, renewed attention brought new interviews with people who had been on the fringes of the original suspect list. Some talked, some refused. In one interview conducted in prison, a man serving time for unrelated violent crimes reportedly told investigators details about the layout of the restaurant that he should not have known. He then, according to detectives, backed away from the statement and refused to elaborate. He died a few years later. Whatever he knew went with him. In the decades since, the case has been complicated by the sheer number of people who have claimed involvement or knowledge. Jailhouse confessions, deathbed statements, anonymous letters. Some of these have led to genuine leads. Most have led nowhere. Investigators today are cautious. They will say on the record that they have theories. They will not say on the record that they have proof. The distinction matters. In an unsolved case this old, it is very easy to construct a narrative that feels complete. It is much harder to prove one in court. One of the enduring questions is why the 4 employees left the restaurant with their killers in the first place. There were no signs of a struggle inside the building. Nothing was broken. The money bag in the office was untouched. Yet at some point that night, 4 teenagers and young adults walked out a back door and got into a vehicle or vehicles with people they either trusted or were being threatened by. Investigators believe a weapon was almost certainly involved. Some have suggested that the killers may have posed as customers or as someone with a legitimate reason to be there at closing time. Others have suggested that at least one of the victims may have known the killer personally. The truth is that no one alive today has said on the record exactly how those 4 young people were taken out of that restaurant. And then there is the drive. 20 miles. From the bright lights of Crawfordsville Road, past highway exits, past gas stations, past other cars, all the way to a wooded area off a rural road in Johnson County. Whoever drove that route knew where they were going. That location was not random. Investigators have long believed the killers had used the area before, possibly to dispose of stolen property, possibly for other reasons. That detail alone has kept the theory of an organized, experienced criminal crew alive for decades. Today, the Burger Chef restaurant in Speedway is gone. The building was eventually demolished. The chain itself, once one of the largest fast food companies in America, was absorbed and dismantled in the 1980s. What remains is a small memorial, a set of names, and 4 families who have spent 46 years waiting for an answer. Jane Freet would have been in her 60s. Ruth Ellen Shelton, Daniel Davis, and Mark Flemons would have been near retirement age. They should have had lives, careers, children. Instead, they have entries in a cold case file that grows heavier every year. The Indiana State Police continues to list the Burger Chef murders as an open, active investigation. Tips are still accepted. Detectives who were not even born in 1978 now work portions of the file. Advances in DNA and forensic technology have offered small, cautious hope, though the loss of the original restaurant scene remains an obstacle that cannot be undone. Every few years, a piece of evidence is retested. Every few years, a name resurfaces. And every few years, the families are asked quietly if they can bear one more round of interviews. They always say yes. Because the truth about this case is that it is not really about a robbery or a wooded field in Johnson County or a chain restaurant that no longer exists. It is about four young people who went to work one Friday night in Indiana and never came back, and about the small, ordinary decisions, an unsealed door, a bin left unphotographed, a first officer's assumption that let their killers slip into the dark and stay there. If this case stayed with you, do one thing: share it. Every time the names Jane Freet, Ruth Ellen Shelton, Daniel Davis, and Mark Flemings are spoken out loud, the case gets a little harder to forget. Subscribe to Dark Cases for a new unsolved investigation every week, and leave a comment with the case you want us to cover next.